It's my pleasure to be chairing this one today with an old friend, Professor Hassan Abbas, who is a professor of International Security Studies at the National Defense University in DC. And we're going to be talking about his new book, The Return of the Taliban. And I hope it'll be an interesting conversation. The way we're going to do it is I'm going to ask him a few questions and we'll have a conversation. And then after a certain time, we'll open it up for anyone else who's online who would like to ask questions as well. First of all, welcome, Professor Abbas, to today's Monday Majlis.
Thank you so much.
Of course, I'm familiar with your work, and but maybe not everyone is. So before I ask you about the book and how it is a follow-up to an earlier book you wrote on the Taliban, perhaps you could say something a bit more about your work, your research, and especially how it engages with the world of policy and other kinds of related issues.
Thank you so much, Professor Sajjad, and also thank you to the Exeter University for the opportunity. My apologies for a slight delayed start. My work is mostly focused on South Asia, but primarily on security issues in South Asia, religion, politics, culture. And I have previously published a few books which are mostly focused on South Asia, but Pakistan specifically. And before this book on the newest book on Afghanistan and Taliban, my previous book on Afghanistan was in 2014, also published by Yale University Press, which was titled The Taliban Revival. And that was the book primarily, which can be actually part one of this book that I've done. The newer book is focused entirely on the very, very contemporary current issues. But in the previous book, The Taliban Revival, I had projected that Taliban were going through a major resurgence and their revival was a fact. And the reason why that happened was I'd gone into the history of the nature of the Pakistan-Afghanistan tribal belt that had allowed Taliban, whether Afghan Taliban or Pakistani Taliban, along with many other militant groups, to find space and to energize themselves and to use that as a platform which they used as a sanctuary. And I had gone into the history of the Pashtuns, who provided, in terms of most of the foot soldiers to the Afghan Taliban movement. By no means every Taliban is a Pashtun, I think, but still about 80% are. So the previous book had gone into the details of the Afghan jihad, inverted commas, against the former Soviet Union. It had gone deep into why there was insurgency and extremism that had happened in Pakistan and how were those issues linked. And last but not the least, the book had gone deep into the inadequacies and ultimately the failure of the state building project in Afghanistan. It had gone into why the new institutions that were being established had failed to take root, or why we should be more patient with that, why some of the new partners that the Western world, especially the United States, NATO, had cooperated with in the shape of so many leaders like Karzai, Ashraf Ghani, many of the others, who were at one level quite energetic and they wanted good for their own country, but they failed to establish a new system because the system remained very tribal in its focus, very parochial, very ethnically focused. And that had given me this, this idea of this theory that why this whole state building project was not delivering the goods. And the return of the Taliban, or at that time I called it the Taliban revival, that was but a matter of time. That was the foundation on which I have built this new course, or this new book, I should say.
Yeah, and we'll come to that. Let me just touch on one thing which I kind of alluded to. One of the things with with militancy in the contemporary world is the way in which certain brands become franchised, right? So we've seen that before with Al-Qaeda. More recently, we've seen this with Daesh and Islamic State. is there a way in which you see Taliban as a brand being franchised similarly? I mean, you mentioned, of course, that people talk about the Taliban in Pakistan. There are other kinds of, there are different branches in many ways of the Taliban. So could you say something a bit more about that process of that franchising, so to speak?
Very good question, I must say, but it is slightly different in a sense from the Al-Qaeda or ISIS franchises, because this is more locally driven. The Taliban were able to draw from some of their traditional historic Pashtun cultural context. I mean, they were a product of the idea of resistance in Afghan history. It was also borrowing from the idea of defiance, which is part and parcel of the Afghan culture. So in that sense, the idea of Taliban, if I call that, was quite local, quite indigenous, and it was unlike other militant and extremist groups for whom their ideology, especially in terms of their politics, in terms of their insurgent model, was the core, and location was secondary. In case of Taliban, the idea was linked to the tribal culture and to the history of Taliban, history of Afghan resistance to all outsiders. That's what galvanized it. And it started off as a movement which was inspired by the religious ideals from mostly Deobandi Islam, which we can talk later on. And so my reaction to the question is, it was more indigenous. It was developing relationships with various transnational organizations. So it had no issues with Al-Qaeda, for instance. In fact, there was, some scholars believe that the Al-Qaeda-Taliban link was quite organic and it was quite extensive. In my research, it tells me it was an alliance of sorts. Al-Qaeda and Taliban never merged into each other, but they had very good relationships. But the kind of more franchise focus of Taliban were only extended to Pakistan, where the Pakistan and Afghanistan share the border and share some of the tribes and share some of the terrain and the mindset also. So that's why the Pakistani Taliban look like that. I have used another term. In fact, I can claim that was first coined by me, which was Punjabi Taliban, which I had used the term to explain some of those Punjabi militants in Pakistan who were more focused on Kashmir, but they were using the space of Afghan Taliban and Pakistani Taliban, using those alliances to extend some of the mindset which was extremist, bigoted, violent within Pakistan, the Punjabi Taliban. But that is how far it goes. It still stays within the Pakistan-Afghanistan region because it is linked to the certain tribal historical memory that they benefit from. So in that sense, it has local franchises, but very, very regional, not international, perhaps.
Okay, well, that's already raised a number of questions which we'll return to, including the question of Deoband. So let me ask you the obvious question is, can you tell us a bit more about this particular book? You know, how does it build upon the previous book? Does it take it in certain directions which you found surprising? If you could say something a bit more just generally about what your findings in many ways are in this particular book.
Thank you. This book, in fact, started off as an idea that I will just write a new chapter for my previous book, Taliban Revival. That's what the first offer from my publisher was. And I immediately thought, no, that book should stand alone. My analysis or conclusions there tragically had come true. And I wanted to maybe not rewrite chapters or add one final chapter. But then the challenge was that the new book should not go again into that history. And my promise to my publisher was, which I was able to keep, that it will start from exactly the day Taliban took over. I violated that understanding only to the extent that I had to go into the Doha peace deal, the famous or infamous, I should say, US-Afghan Taliban deal, which led to called the Doha peace process and the Doha deal, which ultimately led to the return of Taliban to Kabul. So I had to go deep into that. And that was also very important, which took a significant space in the book, maybe about 70 pages or so, because there I could explain how Taliban have changed. The purpose of this book was to explain, to answer the question first, have Taliban changed in any way? Also to answer is if I'm calling that new Taliban, which is a controversial term and now being debated upon, but whether if Taliban had changed and if these are new Taliban, it's a new generation, how far they have changed in their world view, in their mindset, in their ideological outlook, in their local customs perhaps, or especially in terms of their ideas of governance. And so I went from the Doha process to, and I thought it should be a story. So I started off with the Afghan ideological component. Then I went to some of their policies, some of their internal battles. The most interesting or new theme, I think, in the book, which I also learned while writing it, that the most important thing is to explain the hard ideological core of Taliban, which is the old Taliban, the classic Taliban, which were quite narrow-minded, which in terms of their religious orientation, which they believed was the Sharia model of Mullah Omar, had actually borrowed more from local extreme tribal norms than the principles of Islam. But that's how they had mixed everything up, because that was how they were able to reach out to the local customs and local tribal leaders. They were able to incorporate those. These were ultimately alliances among different tribes, and they had to talk more about the tribal norms rather than the Islamic principles. But that was the old Taliban. And the newer Taliban, what I call, are, and by new Taliban, I mean some of those who are very young, because I know that we from research that about 60% of the Taliban today are under the age of 21. So this larger community of Taliban, they were born actually after the last Taliban government of Mullah Omar was dismantled back in 2001. So the new Taliban, all they know about Mullah Omar is they have never seen what that meant. They are a product of the new Afghanistan, which was built there, which was built with the regional help, which was primarily built with the NATO and the US help, and they have seen new institutions. So I wanted to explain, are these new Taliban really different? How will they take care of the governance challenges and economic issues, and how they view politics? And what I figured out at the end, which I've explained in the book, is that there are two political hubs in Afghanistan. And this is for the purpose of simplicity or simple explanation. One is Kandahar. If I may call Kandahar, Kandahar is like not only the heartland of the Pashtun nationalism historically, but also heartland of the Taliban worldview. And the new leader, the supreme leader of Taliban, Mullah Hibatullah, resides there. With his core Shura members. But then the actual governance pattern is built upon the structures that were built in the last 20 years in Kabul. So they have a prime minister, they have 3 deputy prime ministers, they have a cabinet of about 35 people. They never, my main argument in the book is, they are new Taliban in the sense that they never burnt down Kabul. They opted to benefit from what was already there. So the old Taliban, I'll give you one example. The old finance ministry of Taliban during Mullah Omar's time was basically a big box under his bed. And this is, I'm borrowing from the first book of Ahmed Rashid, the famous book on Taliban, where he says whenever Mullah Omar had to give money to someone, he would just get up from his bed, open the big box, take out cash, give it to people. That was the banking system. That was the Ministry of Finance of the old Taliban. The new Taliban, after 2021, appointed somebody as Governor State Bank of Afghanistan, the new bank. They have new ministries. Mullah Baradar, a famous person who was the lead Afghan negotiator with the US, is the one who's managing the 3 economic ministries. And there are regular meetings with World Bank and so many other organizations. So the new Taliban, this is one of the major findings, is the new Taliban, which includes some of the older guys as well from the old Taliban out. But I'm calling them new in a sense of their new perspective, their new approach, that they want to build an Afghanistan, and they not from the scratch, but taking the cue from where things were left out when Karzai is still there, but when Ashraf Ghani escaped. So another example, the older Taliban cabinet of the late 1990s was all mullahs, in the sense that they were graduates of religious seminaries, or that they were known for some of them were known more for their religious qualifications rather than anything else. The newer Taliban have cabinet members who are PhDs also, again, very few, but PhDs from Islamic University in Islamabad, which is not a traditional madrasa. They also, one new appointment is that of a chief of a cricket board. There was no cricket played in Afghanistan 20 years ago, but now it is one of the most popular games. Also, one of the differences is they were forced to get some technocrats. So in that sense, what we see in Kabul is a kind of a newer version of Taliban. I call it actually Taliban 3.0, not Taliban 2.0, because I have called the insurgency years, where the needs and the requirements of the Taliban movement were very, very different. So Taliban movement of 1990s was Taliban 1.0. Insurgency years from 2001 to 2020, I call it Taliban 2.0, because the needs, as I mentioned, were very, very different. It was all about battlefield. It was all about being a warrior. It was all about the battle space narratives. And now what they are faced with is Taliban 3.0, where they are trying to go into the shoes of the Afghan Republic, appointing deputy ministers, appointing officials, wearing uniforms. There was a police academy graduation event, which is kind of unheard of in the old Taliban worldview. They're wearing uniforms. Again, it may look very simple or may look very minor, but to transform themselves, or they are attempting to transform themselves into, if not anything else, a modern government, which is different from the idea of the Taliban Sharia model, which was all about religious edicts and which was all about religious worldview. So these are some of the ways in which Taliban, my conclusions have changed. But at the same time, my last point on this, there is an intense battle and confrontation, both ideological, and they're on the verge of a actual violent conflict as well, between Kandahar's worldview and the Kabul worldview. Kabul wants to engage with the world. They are also, many of them are bigoted and extremist in their worldview, but they want a state which is functioning. Whereas for Kandahar, some people think Kandahar is trying to build the model on Iran, saying we have the religious clergy, which will give the basic principles, and then there'll be people who will actually run the government. I'm not sure if, but the Iranian model has certainly inspired them in terms of the model only, not in theology. That's how I will set the stage of how different factors are at play in Afghanistan today.
That's actually a very good overview, and it does seem that the main, I guess the main motivation for Taliban 3.0, as you call it, is the exigencies of governance, as well as the basic economic situation, which is forcing the formation of a government and formation of the need to look out. Of course, normally when we think of the Taliban in its original guise, and even during the insurgency, there are certain kind of fundamental issues of conflict which always arise, right? So we always think in terms of, yes, there is an ethnic conflict, right? So we're thinking in terms of the Taliban discriminating against ethnic minorities. We're thinking of discrimination against religious minorities, of course, and they overlap in the Hazara, who are a Shia minority. And we think in terms of, for example, access to education, especially the role of women in the public sphere and in education. So, on these kind of flashpoint sort of issues, do you think things have really changed with Taliban 3.0, or is it the case that we're in this sort of wait and see position where the Taliban who are in Kabul would like to project a certain image, but they can't necessarily deliver that on the ground because there are others on the ground who still want to stick to certain red lines, as I see it?
Again, extremely important question. I'll start off by saying I asked this question to about 4 or 5 folks in South Asia, in the government, in different regional governments, both in Pakistan, India, and some of the experts in US, this basic question: do you think Taliban have changed and in terms of their ideological outlook? And almost all of them said there's a consensus on this, that in ideological terms, there's no change. However, in terms of pragmatism, in terms of worldview, which is more in line with developments, because we are all in this day and age impacted by policies and politics of the countries around Afghanistan, with the phone in the hands of everyone, with access to internet, the younger generation is getting impacted. I would argue that they are attempting to change. And I'll give a few examples. For instance, let's take the case of Hazara Shia. By the way, I got huge support from Hazara community afterwards. Since the publication of the book, in fact, I received a lot of new information and background, because many Afghan politicians who I had explained and about their politics and about the last days of the old regime, some of the diaspora Afghan groups reached out to me, and there was so much very kind offers of new information or additional information. So I have some of the things which I'll say are based on things that I've learned since the publication of the book. But so far, nothing challenges, in my view, some of the basic conclusions of the book. The first is about the Hazara, as I was saying. Contrary to the general image that Taliban were very, very anti-Hazara from the word go in terms of their ideological outlook, it is no more very accurate. And the reason is, the old Taliban, we knew they were directly involved in Hazara massacres. They were directly involved in kicking out Taliban from all positions of importance in government. Hazaras were not considered part of the Afghan culture, even from the Taliban lens. This was the old Taliban. The new Taliban, they are 2 cabinet members from Hazara community. One is a PhD. He's dealing with the health issues. Controversial for the Hazara community, but nonetheless, they have maybe a token representation, but they have a representation. Secondly, I had interviewed a few Hazara leaders. One actually a philanthropist from Europe, who's associated with a major Shia philanthropy charity, and he went to Afghanistan, and I interviewed him in detail, and I'm very grateful to him for the insights, and I've mentioned the whole story. And he says, not going into details, but what he garnered, this is about a year ago, was that now Hazara Shia are finding it the situation kind of more relaxed in terms of how Taliban view them. Ashura processions, for example, soon after the Taliban takeover in August 2021, there was the Muharram processions. The Muharram processions and the Ashura is, I must say, commemorated by all Muslims, but largely by the Shia and by the Sufi Muslims. In this case, unlike before, Taliban not only allowed them to hold procession. I have pictures of that, and many people might have seen. They're still on the YouTube also. Kabul's major areas of Kabul were flying these black flags on the day of Ashura. All Taliban said to Shia Hazara community, they are Tajik Shias also, I must add. The only condition was avoid what we call Zanjir Zani, or the flagellation which is done with knives or with sharp elements. And they said everything else is fine, but we will provide you even with security. Same is the case. Leader of the Hazara of the Shias in Mazar Sharif mentioned that Taliban approached them and said, "We know you normally have a huge procession on day of Ashura. we are okay with that in principle, but there is challenge from Daesh, ISIS. And we know that Daesh attacks have been increasing in the last few months. Taliban said to them, we want you to divide your procession into 4 smaller processions, because we'll be able to provide you security to the 4 smaller ones rather than a big procession. There's a counter argument. People think maybe they never wanted the Shias to show big strength as a big procession. Whatever we may argue, we know that the Shias in urban areas were allowed more freedom to commemorate their important sessions and their important events. When I mentioned this kind of finding in one of my interviews in a major international network, I think it was on Al Jazeera, and I received many calls from Hazaras, and this was the time when I was working on the book, and they said, well, what you have mentioned may be true, but this is true only for the urban centers, because Taliban want to project this idea that they are open, they are more flexible with minorities. In the rural areas, they're kicking us out of our land, they're throwing us out of our jobs, and that is also true. So there's this contradiction, but I would say this is different from what the old Taliban, when all Shias just in one go were persona non grata. And now at least they're engaging with them, because there's Daesh now is the new bad boy. Daesh is very, very anti-Sufi, Daesh is very, very anti-Shia, and Daesh is very narrow-minded, and they have been directly involved in attacks on Shia mosques and Imam Bargas. And Taliban, interestingly, are providing security. I added a picture in the book also about the Sakhi shrine, which is mostly kind of a sacred place for the Sufi Muslims. This is belong to a Sufi tradition, but also Shias frequent this place. That place is now from all sides surrounded by the Taliban guards who are safeguarding the place. This is not what old Taliban were up to. So in this sense, there are changes. And I recently interviewed, since the book, of a famous Sufi family from Afghanistan, the Gilani family. Some of their members are there currently. And I asked them, so were you able, one of their family members who actually is in London, recently I was in London and I was able to interview them. And they mentioned that they are not stopped from preaching, and they are engaging in different sessions, spiritual sessions of discussions. And in a couple of cases, the local Taliban leaders attended, and they remained quiet. They were not kind of real participant. Maybe they were watching. That is also relatively new when it comes to Taliban. So things are changing on policies on girls' education, which is an extremely important issue. I've dedicated my book to the women of Afghanistan, and we know all of us are seriously concerned about Taliban not allowing girls to go to school even from primary level onwards. But I must add, there are certain areas in Afghanistan which were in defiance of this injunction. And there are Taliban leaders in Kabul wearing their turbans and with religious credentials who directly challenged the policy of Mullah Hibatullah. To an extent that it led to major confrontation, at this so far only in verbal terms, but the fact that there's a challenge and there's debate and that is being discussed is open. Last but not the least, Kabul, during the first Taliban government, women have to wear the burqa, what we call also a derogatory way, the shuttlecock burqa. Today, women in Afghanistan are required to have headgear, but in Kabul also, they're wearing the traditional dupatta, what they call, which is not covering your face. And Taliban are okay with it. Although in principle, they have said there has to be full veil, but they are not enforcing it in the way the old Taliban used to do it. So in these ways, there's an attempt to change in certain areas, not in all areas. That's why I think the new Taliban, or the new Taliban reality, if I should put it like that, is much different from before. And that's why there's a case which I make for engagement, because I believe if we will engage, if the Western world, if the international community by and large will engage with them, there's more likelihood that those who are relatively moderate, the moderate word is very complicated and tricky word to use, but let me say pragmatic. The pragmatic elements among the Taliban who want change will feel more empowered if there is international engagement, which may ultimately lead to recognition.
Thank you, Hassan. I do have other questions, but at this point, I want to open it up to those who are joining us online. So if you could maybe put your hand up or indicate that you'd like to ask a question or make a comment, and then bring you in. Anyone want to ask anything?
The last question, please.
Yes, Ali, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much for the speaker. It was very fascinating. I got, in fact, my question is this one. As you know better than we do, Taliban has been created by the America and the West. They come initially against the Russia war, then gradually change. And there is a point from the Hafiz, this is in Persian as mukafat amal ghafil masho gandam az gandam beruye juz jo. It means you shouldn't be sort of negligible about the consequence of an action. If you plant the wheat, you harvest wheat. If you plant the barley, you harvest the barley. I mean, the first reaction, what happened, Taliban or that sort of mentality people as to America was 9/11. You think, because recently, I mean, the Biden, all the administration, they give all the army peacefully handed over the new Taliban, which you mean is that they're younger. But don't you think the future it causes more problem for the region and for the West as well?
Thank you very much. Sajjad, you may have to summarize the later part of the question. I heard the first part clearly, but not the later part. I can start with the first part. But the last question was whether the Taliban have a future in a regional sense.
Against Iran and for the West, and they're trying to expand the power in the other Islamic country like UAE.
I think the point was about the capture of equipment in particular. There's always been a suspicion that the capture of equipment towards the end, when the Americans was fleeing, was somehow planned and not necessarily the effect of events, unfolding very quickly.
Thank you. No, this is important question in a sense that is talked about a lot. And so the initial part, I don't think Taliban were created by the United States, the first Taliban. They were a product of the Afghan jihad, yes, which had received tremendous amount of money from regional countries, especially Saudi Arabia. It was the policy or politics was that of the global politics, United States versus the former Soviet Union. That was the inspiring factor or the organizational factor at play. Pakistanis provided the space and the training, collecting all these Afghan leaders, Afghan Mujahideen together, and regional countries were also helping, but Saudi Arabia primarily was funding it. That was the old Afghan jihad. And when that collapsed, when the Soviet Union was pushed out and those Mujahideen leaders started fighting among themselves, it was for money, it was for greed. There was chaos in Kabul, was primarily done or committed by Ahmad Shah Massoud and Hikmatyar, primarily Hikmatyar. Kabul was destroyed at that time by Hikmatyar. And the reason I mentioned, there was a negative reaction to that internal conflict which happened between the Afghan Mujahideen at that time. That was the factor which led to the creation of the new Taliban, or creation of the Taliban, I should say, in the first instance in 1993, 1994. So there are many books written on the subject, and some believe, which the view that I prescribe as well, it was more so an indigenous movement, but then was significantly supported by Pakistan, because most of the foot soldiers of the Afghan jihad were those who were the graduates of the Pakistani madrasas. And I'll talk about Haqqaniya Madrasa a bit later also. Haqqaniya Madrasa had provided most of the leadership of that. So that was the old Taliban. They had received big support from the foot soldiers from Pakistan. But the main idea, the main movement to, I believe, now there are very good 2 or 3 books by Mullah Zaif, also by a couple of other scholars, which all says that it was an internal movement, of course, significantly supported at that time by Pakistan. The insurgency was by and large local and indigenous, again, supported in big way by Pakistan, but other regional players as well. The new Taliban, and this question I've asked to many people, those US leaders as well and others who were responsible for the withdrawal. There's a consensus in the United States, for example, that the whole withdrawal planning and the whole withdrawal process was a big mess up and was a big mistake. It has political connotations. It has political implications for President Biden, and he's being rightly questioned. And now there is an Afghanistan commission that has been formed with 13 members, actually led by co-led by a Muslim lady scholar, also and practitioner, Ms. Shumaila Chaudhry. The reason I'm mentioning this is still being debated in US. Why US withdrew? All the equipment that was left over was left with the intention, to the best of my understanding, for the Afghan security forces. Now, the failure of the Afghan security forces is a big question mark. Why all those 200,000 people, some say 300,000 Afghan soldiers, the new Afghan military, the Afghan police, they just evaporated. They just left Afghanistan, and that all happened when Ashraf Ghani escaped. And this is the strangest thing in the story, is why there was not a single shot fired in Kabul challenging the Taliban. That Americans had nothing to do with that. Americans had already left in an irresponsible fashion, I must add. And there's a big criticism of that and big challenge to the way in which US and NATO had exited Afghanistan. But let's keep that story on the side for a second. When US left, the understanding was that Ashraf Ghani is the president. There's a cabinet. There's an elected cabinet. There are so many major leaders, from Dostum to Ismail Khan to Atta Muhammad Noor, so many others who were very big players. The understanding was that Afghan security forces will stay intact. What they were all of that was take that into consideration. So this equipment, the weapons, were meant for the Afghan security and Afghan police. When they ran away, no one was expecting it. And I went into deep this research, myself included. I got that wrong till the final moment. I was regularly saying it on Al Jazeera, on CNN, everywhere else, that yes, Taliban are on the verge of takeover of Afghanistan, but not Kabul, because the Afghan security will defend Kabul till the final moment. And somehow not a single fire was shot. So it was circumstances which are very strange still. Now Taliban, of course, own all of that equipment. My theory in the book is that Taliban did something which no one was expecting. Taliban fought, from their point of view, fought very well on the ground. But then Taliban slowly and gradually, and this credit goes to a person by the name of Khalil Haqqani, who is uncle of Siraj Haqqani, the current interior minister. He's known for his negotiation skills. He was the one who was spearheading the whole old approach of Taliban 1 year, which was cutting deals with the tribal leaders. So when the big issue was Doha negotiations, when Doha negotiations happened, Afghanistan knew that the days of this Afghan Republic are over, and that Taliban are on the go, and the Taliban are on the roll, because they knew that if US has cut directly a deal with Taliban, that has empowered them. So I agree with that part. That is being debated upon as well, that the way back to Kabul for Taliban was opened because there was a successful negotiated deal between United States and Taliban. No denying of that fact. But the understanding was that there will be an interim government in the beginning, led by Mullah Baradar. And Mullah Baradar is the relatively pragmatic leader of the pragmatic group, I should say, within the Taliban. The understanding was that Taliban's Hibatullah will be the top leader, Mullah Baradar will be a leader, and there'll be some members of the Afghan Republic from the Karzais and the Ashraf Ghani government, and they will be part and parcel of the government. And I learned later on through very credible sources after the book that there was 2 planes standing at the tarmac in Kabul. One was by UAE, sponsored, which was Ashraf Ghani's escape route he was running away from the scene. There was another plane from Doha, which was supposed to take Ashraf Ghani. They were both meant for Ashraf Ghani. Ashraf Ghani was supposed to go to Doha because there would be a transition government which would be in place. But Ashraf Ghani opted to escape because he was full. This was his revenge. He thought that he would not be part and parcel of a plan which will allow Taliban back in. So he thought that I've gone into this theory in detail in the book, that Zalmi Khalilzad, the former president Karzai, and Mullah Baradar were all in league, and this was the American plan, so to say, to have a transition government. And he was right. This was the plan, to the best of my knowledge. That I figured out. I have no empirical evidence, but many interviews led me to this path. But when Ashraf Ghani ran away, everything collapsed. And the Khalil Haqqani's approach of negotiating with so many tribal leaders, they had surrounded Kabul. And when there was a total collapse, Taliban just walked in and nobody challenged them. So I asked most Afghan leaders who are saying that America is behind the Taliban revival. I said, then you all must be part and parcel of the American plan, because it was inconceivable for any outsider to cut deals with those small negotiations that happened with all the tribes surrounding Kabul. That happened because Afghanistan in itself, including all groups, either they gave up or they gave in. I mean, howsoever you want to put it, it was a collective failure which led to Taliban's return to Kabul. And I believe now Taliban have excellent relationship with regional countries, with Iran, for example. Iran has excellent relationship with Taliban, although there were skirmishes on the water issues. But whether it was Ismail Khan when he ran to Iran also, Uzbekistan today is providing them free electricity. Qatar, of course, Turkey and UAE were in a battle that who will get the contract for the international airport in Kabul. So regional countries all have their own favorites within the Taliban and other groups as well. So this time, unlike the old Taliban, for whom the biggest supporter was Pakistan, the new Taliban have excellent relationships from Uzbekistan and Tashkent. Negotiations are in front of us, from Moscow to China. The Chinese foreign minister has photographs. If you Google Chinese foreign minister meeting the Afghan foreign minister Muttaqi. So today's Taliban are much more networked, and it is so because they have approached a regional angle, and they are reaching out to all regional countries for support, and they are quite successful, I must say, in their diplomatic outreach in regional terms.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Excellent.
We have a question about, well, a fairly obvious question. How dangerous is your work? Can you actually do research in Afghanistan and talk to people if you are in Afghanistan? And if you are in Afghanistan, how closely are you monitored? I mean, this is like the classic questions, because a lot of our students and colleagues who do research in all sorts of parts of the world face that particular issue. Yeah.
Excellent question. I traveled to the region quite a bit before the book. My life before the book and after the book is different, and I'll explain. It changed because Zabiullah Mujahid, the official spokesperson of Taliban with 750,000 followers, did a tweet challenging my work and calling me a spy or intelligence agent. I don't know what he meant by that. And I responded to that as well by saying, I'm an academic. I've done various previous books. I worked in government in Pakistan, but that was 25 years ago. And this book is more of my work. So I'd interviewed Taliban leaders in many, I'll not name one, but 3 countries regionally in the Gulf, where I met Taliban leaders, engaged with them. I've interviewed one of the team members who were in the first team that went into Kabul. You'll see the story there. And with academic books, you have to go through peer process, not once, but in my case, twice. And in most cases, I have footnotes. I mentioned I had good access to intelligence and military officials in the United States, in Pakistan, in India also, and in Gulf countries as well. So my research was, you'll see in the footnotes, I've explained all these things in details. And there was some criticism that I, of course, borrowed a lot from my interviews with military and intelligence officials, how much you trust. And that is, again, it's not that when an ex-intelligence officer tells you a story that you will just buy it immediately. In my case, I think it was only 20% of what I heard from the security officials across the world, out of 20% out of what I heard. But in each case, I talked to either a Taliban or an Afghan cabinet minister. Various members of the former Afghan government were very helpful in this book as well. And that's why I think that's what Taliban were really angry at when they tweeted. After that Zabiullah Mujahid tweet, they put my picture on Twitter and mentioned, very ironically and very different from the old Taliban, who always used to say we are internally focused. They in fact said that they would target and they will engage their cells, international cells, to target me. This is all on the Twitter. This is on the BBC monitoring report. And this was all mentioned in an interview last Saturday by MSNBC on Ali Velshi show. So if any one of your students will Google Ali Velshi show MSNBC, it gives all those tweets and details. So now it is extremely difficult. It is now hard for me probably to go to Pakistan also with some of the Taliban factors. So now my future research will be difficult. But now with this book, there's so many people who have approached me with more stories, with more details, some challenging me. And I'm totally open to being challenged. That's what, as an academic, I'm trained to do. And in many cases, if there is a mistake, I will be more than happy to acknowledge it and to say I stand corrected and to correct that in the paperback. But the initial research was made possible because of my years as a teacher in a security institution, where I had access to so many Afghan students, Pakistani students, US students. Also my research with based having done the previous book, then you build a network of people in the region, elsewhere, who you continuously talk to, and then you build your narrative. And you also depend on the works of so many other scholars. So there's a detailed bibliography. There are 4 major books that I learned a great deal from. Those are all mentioned in the book introduction.
Thank you. Any further questions or comments from our audience this evening? Maria, go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much. This is really fascinating, and I'm looking forward to reading the book. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about where your research and analysis kind of took you in terms of the women question. And specifically what I'm interested in is, like, there's this sense that this new Taliban 3.0 is more image conscious, which you've described. And when it comes to things like Hazara rights and minority rights, there's more of an effort to appear to be assimilating and bringing people together. And then obviously some of the reporting has shown like fractures between what different members think about women's education specifically, but also other kind of areas around women's public participation. But why do you think this has been like what's your sort of sense of why this has been still such an intransigent issue, and still, despite losing aid money, because you're talking about wanting to bring, to have engagement and direct, like, it's caused so many rifts with international aid, and even organizations that have like really tried to stay there as long as possible have now had to, like, it's really compromised their work. And why has this in your opinion, like, what is it about this particular issue, and where is the pressure coming from? And I'm just curious if you sort of heard or spoke or came across different sort of perspectives on that question.
Thank you so much for this question. And this was one of the hard issues that I had to struggle with, because the facts on the ground are very, very worrisome and very, very problematic. And I'll give you an example. This one book that I had a chance to read, which I've used, which is published, which is written by the Chief Justice, Hakim Ishaq Zai, Abdul Hakim Ishaq Zai, who's the Chief Justice of Afghanistan today. He's the author of this book called The Modern Governance of Afghanistan Under the Taliban. I'm paraphrasing. And this book is a book full of bigotry, about women, about other human rights issues. It was, I can safely say, of all the books that I've read, the most disgusting work that I came through. And the reason why I mention this is, I mean, he at one point mentioned something to the effect that women are not equal human beings even. So that is the Kandahar school. That is not even, I would call, this is not the Deoband Hanafi Sunni school of thought as well. I've never seen any Deobandi, the mainstream Deobandi Hanafi Sunni scholars go to this an extent. So this is that part that some of these Taliban, especially the hardliners in Kandahar, they borrowed from some extreme tribal norms. This is not even a standard Afghan tribal worldview. But there are some groups which think like that. For instance, saying that women cannot go out of house and even to a doctor unless there's likelihood that they are dying. So that worldview is what we see behind kick women out of jobs. But what Kabul did was, when they received these newer injunctions, okay, there should be no women in cabinet, no surprise, no women in government jobs. And they had so many women who came to office in those ministries, which the new system Taliban inherited. And as I'd mentioned, they opted not to burn it down, not to burn down Kabul, but to engage with Kabul and to take up those positions. So the first day they said, okay, women will be moved to different positions. The second they said, okay, women are not allowed in office. But they said, you are government officials, you'll receive your salary at home. That was some change. Then there were these issues of school, in which then there was a reaction. When the third layer of this policy instructions came from Kandahar, there was reaction. Because many of the Taliban leaders, in fact, two of the Taliban leaders that I talked to, who were part of the Doha negotiations as well, they immediately, when I mentioned to them about the girls' issue, they are holding very important positions in current Taliban government. They both said to me, similar response. They said, you know, our own daughters go to school in Doha and in UAE. How can one of them said, how, Hassan, I can be against girls going to school? And I said, so why is we are not seeing that in the policy? His reaction was, it is not an edict or a fatwa that has been issued. Currently, we are saying we are changing the system in curriculum, in administratively, logistically, and we will get to a point where girls will be allowed back in school. By the way, private schools in Afghanistan, even today, are allowing girls to go to school, but there's, of course, there are few private schools and everyone cannot afford those schools. So in terms of the worldview about women, from the Afghan point of view, it has not changed much because of I hate to say that, but I can't think of any other better frame. There are some tribal norms. There are some cultural things in the rural areas, in the periphery, not in the mainstream Kabul. The mainstream Kabul of 60s and 70s, you can Google and you can see pictures. It was different. It was like, in some ways, Iran, some of the urban centers I'm talking about. Some of the educated people, they would never think in terms of shutting doors on women for jobs, for education, for anything else. But it is the rural elite now which brought Taliban into government. So they are struggling with this. And historically, anything which is seen as a Western ideal or something that is being pushed by the West, this is from the Abdur Rahman years, we are talking about last 200-300 years. There's an immediate knee-jerk reaction among the Taliban and among ordinary Afghans also, but especially among Taliban, by saying, oh, there is another war, cultural war being staged against us. So we have to take up this issue through negotiations in a very careful fashion. Afghan women themselves are fighting. The Hazara women especially are at the forefront of it. There have been processions even lately, even as last week, when young Afghan women I think they are the bravest of all. If there was, I must have mentioned it, if there was any resistance put up to Taliban by anyone, it was not by the Afghan security forces, by police, by all those big warlords and those big warriors, from Dostum to Ismail Khan to Ata Muhammad Noor, who tried to say that they were really brave and they wanted a different Afghanistan. They all ran away. It is the Afghan women in Kabul who stood up and who are still challenging. I think there's this indigenous support base that the educated Afghan women are getting. which may force ultimately Taliban to rethink. Some of their members are already rethinking. That's how I see the situation.
I see we have 2 hands up, so we'll take those. Samir first, go ahead, and then we'll move to Mohammed.
Hello. Thank you, Sajjad. Thank you for this, Mr. Abbas. Well, I don't know. I mean, I don't know much about the country, but I think I'll begin by saying, from the little I know about the history of Afghanistan, and as you mentioned, this is a country that has been for centuries quite poor, quite isolated, predominantly rural. The urban elites are quite a small minority, into the outside world, and all attempts at modernization, which would always entail a degree of westernization, had failed, basically. I mean, you know much better, but there was I think that King Amanullah about a century ago.
True.
And then there was the madness of the communists, which was madness, you know, what they tried to do. And we know where these two ended. And I totally understand and agree that the Taliban is an organic growth, you know, foreign support notwithstanding. But my first question is that how is this country ever going to get out of this? If the majority of the population is still rural and poor and lives in this very, very isolated and narrow-minded, I mean, you're right. The category Islam is a very broad one. And what you get from an exegesis or a reading in the mountains of Najd, let's not say Afghanistan will be very different from what you get in Aleppo or Cairo or Mashhad, you know, or Najaf. So how would it get out of that? And that begs other questions, you know, that go beyond Afghanistan about the failures and limitations of political Islam in general. Because my impression, having lived and worked in Qatar, as Sajjad knows, Qatar is a country where there's a passion for political Islam, and the natural tendency is to be sympathetic to anything that raises this banner, and to be blind to the shortfallings of that. And there are many shortfallings, not just to the Taliban, but to all the strands of political Islam. And one ironic thing, I think it was Ahmed Jannati in Iran, I think, if my memory serves correctly, who in the 90s said that Taliban should be a model for the Islamic Republic, not the other way around. Taliban oppressing women and locking them at home is what we should be doing here in Iran, you know. And I think the man who now heads the Experts Council, I think it is Jannati. So it just begs a lot of questions, and that I'll leave it at there. But I wouldn't only blame tribal. I mean, people will read the Sharia in what fits their setting. You know, they will come to interpretations, even if they are off the mainstream. And in that, Taliban is no novelty. But the question is, how do you deal with it? So sorry for my gloom and doom, but so it seems to me. Thank you.
There's quite a lot there. So over to you, Hassan. Especially the political Islam question is very big. But anyway, please go ahead.
Absolutely. And thank you, Sajjad. These are, in your session, this is an excellent question. And I had many other events and they were good questions, but the best question so far in all of my events, and this is maybe 10th event, is in your program. So thank you very much for this engaged audience. I'll answer briefly also. I have in my own university at National Defense University, today is a book launch in about 50 minutes. So I'll wrap up a bit quickly to prepare for that and go there. Excellent question. How to get out of it? I think the regional approach is the answer. I'm convinced that United States now has very little leverage, or any international organization, NATO or UN even. UN may have a chance because UN represents the international community's voice in a more credible way. What I'm saying is not something very popular where I live in the United States, my home, but I think Taliban will listen far more carefully and intently to anything coming from UN. The other approach will be regional. Pakistan has its stakes. There are some of their friends are in very holding important positions in Kabul. Iran has influence, as I mentioned previously, Uzbekistan, Qatar, and Qatar is showing some kind of action and energy. The Prime Minister of Qatar landed actually in Kandahar to see Mullah Hibatullah, the head of the Taliban, last week. And that's the first time Mullah Hibatullah met any international leader. I think probably he met some senior officials from Pakistan previously, but this was his first meeting, because there was a pressure on Qatar also, that you were hosting the whole Doha negotiations. And by the way, in Doha negotiations, it is a fact that Taliban had committed that they will open schools, keep schools open for girls, and keep jobs open for women. And many people thought this was discussed in closed doors. Now a short video has come out also, where a current Taliban cabinet member, I think it's Mr. Khair, he's one of those who are on the book title as well, who is saying this publicly, that we will allow girls to go to school. This was during the Doha negotiations. So how to get out of this situation? You're absolutely right. That the modernization has not touched the country in a way. It has touched other countries in the region. There are other issues of lack of infrastructure development, education, and war, and especially war-torn economy. Afghanistan has been destroyed in wars from between the old Afghan jihad against Soviet Union, the current war, even between the 20 years when the Afghan insurgency was going on. I often feel the biggest victims of all this is ordinary Afghans who have gone through, and they are still going through hell. And the only workable approach will be Pakistan, Iran, UAE, Turkey, Qatar, Uzbekistan, even Tajikistan, developing a consensus, include China, of course, and Russia as well. They all go to Taliban together and say, we are very much concerned about the space again being used by international terrorist organization. Daesh is operating in this area. If there is a regional consensus, I think that is the way out. And these regional countries perhaps can aid, provide some funding, also training as well. And those in Kabul are looking for those opportunities. That is the only way, it seems. If region will not take ownership of Afghanistan, and everyone will try to make best use of this opportunity for pursuing their own vested interests, Afghanistan will continue to be a center of chaos and conflict, and that chaos will not stay in Afghanistan. It will again have implications, which I am not happy to say this, but may have international consequences. If region is not going to put its house in order, the question of political Islam is much larger indeed. But I would argue the degeneration of Islamic political thought is the biggest problem. We are not seeing any new developments in that arena. Arab Spring had offered some hope, democracy in Turkey, in Pakistan, Bangladesh had offered a way out, but each of these cases, it is either failing or proving to be inadequate. And that's why the project of the political Islam currently offers no hope. That's why this model of Taliban, which is very, very dogmatic, which is very, very conservative, which is not a remedy to the problems in Muslim majority states, is again being attempted. The fact that Taliban are back there, and people, those who are in Kandahar, they represent that mindset. The fact that they're still the most dominant group is not only reflective of things that have gone wrong in Afghanistan, it is also reflective of what ails the Muslim political Islam, or the Muslim political worldview, I dare say.
Let's take
I couldn't agree. Thank you.
Let's take this one last question from Mohammed. Please go ahead.
Hi, thank you, Mr. Sajid, and thank you, Hassan. I have two questions. My first question is, you're good about the change in Taliban. Is it really a change of Taliban, or there is a change and transformation in Afghanistan itself? I mean, they should have been changed. They have no choice to do to make their changes. And my second question is, you said about international engagement and anything else that they should be connected with the region overall. If they want I mean, the Taliban, if they want to make any changes, how would it justify for its food fighters? I mean, there are food fighters who are peasants from different rural areas, how they will be conflicting in the war against Daesh, against other regional targets. So there is a justification of both religion and ruler, and of course, ethnical issues that they are sticking all of those groups together. I have a third question, but I will just leave it there. Thank you.
Hassan, yes, please, over to you.
Thank you so much, Mohammed. Excellent questions again. Really appreciate your interest. You're very right, actually. Taliban are being forced to change. It is not Taliban. It is a new Afghanistan which they are faced with. This is a very good point, and this I've explained in my book as well. And I'm saying this is what is something that is forcing them, but also the new Taliban, the younger generation, because they neither have gone to any madrasas. It is very striking that the number of madrasas in Pakistan is huge, but in Afghanistan, traditionally, there were no big traditional madrasa chains. There were some madrasas, but not many, as one would guess. So the younger generation was more inspired by ideas of defiance. There were economic challenges. That's why they were forced to join Taliban. They all are now, they have exposure to the world, because they have the exposure to the world right in their hands, which was not the case with any previous generation. So they can see what is the new developments are, the new politics, the new views are. That's why Taliban, there's this forcing factor at play as well. And Taliban, I'll give them this much credit, that if the Kandharis, or I'm not saying Kandharis because that has a certain connotation, I'm saying those placed in Kandahar today, if things were left to them, they would have burnt down Kabul. Some of these players in Kabul who decided that we will function, we will take the country to the next stage from what we have inherited. So they inherited the new systems and institutions. In that sense, the Western investment in Afghanistan is not lost. There's a new middle class. But the tragedy is that the most of those educated had to run away from Afghanistan. Some of them are going back step by step. If Taliban have any sense, they would like to welcome them back. Initially, they gave this impression. They gave an important statement every major speech. And look at that is available on YouTube also. The first press conference by Zabihullah Mujahid and others. They said, we have forgiven people. We have, even whenever they are confronted by US in some shape or form, some of the top warriors who have fought against the US say clearly, look, what has happened has happened. Let's bygone be bygones. Let's start a new page. So in that sense, they are showing willingness. Those in Kabul are showing willingness also. Why are they showing willingness? One, they have learned this much, that the last time they were kind of rigid in giving up Bin Laden, they had to lose the whole of Afghanistan. Secondly, those who ran away at that time lived their lives in many of the regional countries, especially in Pakistan, Turkey, UAE, and Doha. They have seen the world now. So there are some people from the old guard also who have far more exposure. They are open to change because they have seen a different world. And then the younger generations push, and the push from women. Again, I'm not trying to paint a rosy picture that their things are about to transform and it is about to be liberated again from within the Taliban. No, but I'm saying there are far more chances of that happening if the region put its foot down by giving them some conditions. And if Taliban in Kandahar would know that Qatar, UAE, Pakistan, Iran, even China, they will all say no to some of the bigotry that they are showing, Taliban will have no option but to react. That's ultimately my main case. And also that briefly touches upon your other issues. The big challenge for them is how to transform from being an insurgent organization. They were doing insurgency. They were battle hardened. They're warriors. They have no clue what governance means. But they are showing again some interest. I know that Taliban have even approached India to train some of their bureaucrats, which was a big deal. Taliban historically with India, their relationship was very bad. So they are showing that they want some of their warriors to transform. I hope that that segment of Taliban will get more support and will get more power, and they will be more inclusive, because the Afghan diaspora has a lot to offer as well. That change may take some time, but that's my main crux. Engagement with Taliban will open up door for the Afghan diaspora to also go back, force Taliban to be more inclusive, and that would lead to a way out and lead to a relatively a positive change for Afghanistan.
Thank you. I think we need to draw this to a close. Thank you very much to Professor Hassan Abbas. I mean, the last, we could have asked you a last question about the diaspora, which I think is an interesting one, but maybe next time, inshallah. So thank you for joining us, everyone, and we will be back next week with another Monday Majlis. Incidentally, just to remind everyone, the poster does have a discount code, so if you're interested in getting hold of Hassan's book, please do use that discount code. It's quite an affordable book and definitely worth reading. So thank you, everyone, and good night.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.